Hi, I'm Beth with American Patchwork and Quilting, and welcome to our second tips video in our Blast from the Past mystery sampler. American Patchwork and Quilting is turning 30 in 2023, and to celebrate, we're counting down with this 30-block mystery sampler, one block from each year of our history. So this month we're releasing 2 blocks, and they both use strip set construction. Strip sets are a great way to save time while quilting and are used in many different patterns. So for strip set construction, what you're doing is sewing together longer strips, then subcutting, and then sewing those strips together to make your units. So in this block, this is made of strip set construction. It's not individual squares, which would be much more difficult to assemble. So this is a really efficient way to quilt, and it can also be more accurate. First things first, accurate cuts are key to making sure your strip sets will turn out well. So if you're struggling with accuracy, I do love using an AccuQuilt fabric die cutting machine and a strip die. So these are really versatile dies. They come in multiple different widths. So I have my 2-inch strip cutting die here because that's what we need for block 5. So I love using these because you can cut several fabrics at once and get your really accurate strips. So I have this laid out. Just make sure your fabric is fully covering the blade portion that you want to cut. And then you can add your cutting mat. And then I'm using the Go Big Electric. This is great for people who have maybe issues with their hands, maybe arthritis or carpal tunnel. It's really nice for that. Just turn it on. And it just pulls it through for you. It is so nice and handy. Just gonna grab that so it doesn't fall off the table there. And then when you pull that off, look at those nice strips. If you just don't like the cutting portion of quilting, this is a really helpful tool. It's always a good idea to test your seam allowance before you sew all of your strip sets together. So what we recommend is taking 3 1.5-inch wide strips and sewing them together. So once you've sewn those together, then your center strip should be exactly 1 inch wide. So I exaggerated it a little bit on this one, but you can see it's much smaller than 1 inch, and so we're about 1/8 of an inch too small. So you'd want to adjust your needle until that center strip is exactly 1 inch. So you just have to start again with another set of 1.5-inch strips until you get that exactly 1 inch like we did here. We find in most cases that the seam is too big, so you'd need to adjust to sewing with a scant 1/4-inch seam to make sure you're accurate. So this would just mean that you'd need to bump your needle a little bit to the right. When sewing the strips, I like to use a 1/4-inch foot with a guide, but it's still important to test that seam allowance before you start. I've typically found that I do need to adjust my needle position even when using this type of foot. When sewing, try not to steer the fabric too much. I find it to be more accurate if I let my machine pull the strips through. And if you find your seam is getting a little wavy, you can try adjusting your speed. So you might find it easier if you go faster or slower. Just see what works best for you. Pressing is also really important. It's a good idea to turn the steam setting off on your iron, as sometimes that steam can cause a little distortion when you press. So what I like to do is finger press my piece open, and then you want to come along parallel to the seam and just press, not iron, so you're not pushing the iron much, you're just holding it. And you kind of want to run along parallel to the seam. If you're pushing too much away from the seam, you can cause a little distortion or waviness that way too. We also recommend pressing after each strip is added rather than waiting until they're all sewn together. And be sure to follow the pressing instructions because that will help your seams nest when you go to sew the pieces together. Once you're ready to subcut the pieces, first you want to square up one edge. They do get a little bit uneven on the ends a lot of times, so you want to just kind of cut off to give yourself a nice square edge to measure from. And then as you're cutting, you want to line up your ruler lines with the seam, just so you make sure you get a nice straight cut. And if you find like a section that maybe isn't very good and you can tell it's not very straight, just try to cut around that if you can. For block 4 with this tiny little checkerboard, there's a quick way to tell if your seam is accurate. So after you have a few of these sewn together and you're pressed toward the darker fabric, flip it over and just make sure these two seams are kind of butting up right up against each other. If there's too big of a space or you're overlapping a lot, that is an indicator that your seam is not accurate, and you'll want to check that before you continue sewing your strips. So for this block, I do think this checkerboard is adorable, but it is a lot of seams. So if you aren't wanting to attempt it, you can go ahead and use a 3.5-inch square of fabric instead. Here are the two completed blocks. I used the Merry Little Christmas line by Bonnie and Camille for Moda Fabrics for these. On block 4, I just love this red and white checkerboard in the center. It reminds me of peppermint candy. And then for block 5, I did use a little bit of this holiday print in the center instead of using the stripe, just to bring in a little more of that print. This is the cutest line, and now it makes me want to make a second version of this block of the month in this holiday fabric. So once you've completed your blocks, share them with us in our private Facebook group or on Instagram with the hashtag APQ Blast from the Past. I can't wait to see your blocks 4 and 5.